Well, again, thank you for the introduction. As Hannah mentioned, my name's Patrick Leyshock. I am with the Knight Cancer Institute at Oregon Health and Science University. I manage the data management system team, which is part of the precision oncology program at the Knight Cancer Institute. So first of all, big thank you to LabKey for the opportunity to present today. It supported us over the years, and it's nice to be able to share what we built with LabKey server. Also want to thank attendees for taking the time out of their day to listen in. And just a reminder as well, if you do have questions, the Zoom conference has a little Q&A button there, and feel free to drop them in. Got about 9 slides today, and I want to share with everybody how we use, at the Knight Cancer Institute, how we use LabKey server to support precision oncology. So I want to start with talking about what precision oncology is, and I'm going to take a page from Josh's book earlier this week, and if you're a physician, you may want to cover your ears as I give a sort of very simple introduction to precision oncology. What is precision oncology? So I think it's helpful to start with what precision oncology is not. And so in the event that of a cancer diagnosis, the status quo when it comes to cancer treatment, and there are exceptions to this, but generally the status quo is, depending on what organ the tumor manifests itself, you were given a treatment. And this is a fairly straightforward approach. Again, there are exceptions to this, but the tumor shows up in the liver, you're given this treatment. Tumor shows up in the lung, you're given this other treatment. So this approach works, again, with exceptions, but this is the general practice. That's not precision oncology. The important thing that this basic status quo approach misses is that at the genomic level, at the microscopic level, at the architectural, at the structural level, 2 tumors in the same organ in 2 different individuals may actually be very, very different diseases. So just because 2 different people both have liver cancer doesn't mean, again, at this fine grain level, that their diseases may be very different things. So that precision oncology wants to understand not liver cancer or lung cancer, but it wants to understand each individual disease at that fine grain level. Given that understanding, wants to make a targeted treatment recommendation for that particular person's tumor. So that is the broad vision of precision oncology. What this requires, as you can gather, is we need to be able to understand each individual's tumor at this fine grain level, at this genomic level, at the structural level, at the microscopic level, at the architectural level. So we need to have this understanding, and we need data, of course, to arrive at this understanding. So we've talked about the status quo of cancer care. We've talked about precision oncology. What about data management? I'll say this very, very respectfully. The physicians at OHSU are world-class. The researchers are top-notch, doing cutting-edge work. But again, respectfully, when it comes to managing data, a lot of these folks can barely use Excel. And again, respectfully, I get that. It's not their job. They're great at what they do. Their job is not to manage data. Examples of the status quo, often, again, especially research data, you've got multiple spreadsheets owned by multiple different people. Data is siloed into different components of software. For example, you might have all your genomics information in a dedicated database. You might have all your specimen data stored in a different database, all your imaging information stored in yet another database. Phrase I heard at last year's LabKey conference was platform fatigue. And this is where you need to, for example, access multiple different systems just to answer simple questions. Questions like, show me all the data we have for this particular patient. So again, the status quo, with some exceptions for data management, there's a lot of room for improvement. And as we've said, detailed understanding of each patient's tumor arrived at through data is essential for precision oncology. So the status quo in data management simply isn't tenable for doing precision oncology. So that's where our team was brought in. And we were brought in to create a complete and correct collection of data that can be used to do precision oncology. I don't think data management is a solvable problem, so to speak. It's a problem you can mitigate, a problem you can live with, a problem you can minimize. And so again, that is our charge. Broadly, I won't read this off to folks, but this is the charge, the mission of our team. I'll call out in blue here, just to reference the two main groups of folks we support. We're going to go into a little bit more detail in a few minutes, but roughly, physicians, doctors, are the ones who need good, accurate, correct, and complete data to make clinical decisions. And researchers, of course, need that same data, except they're using it for a different purpose, to do research discovery, hypothesis testing, hypothesis generation. So success for our team, for the data management system team, means that these two groups, clinicians and researchers, can do their jobs easier, that their day-to-day work is easier. What we did in order to do this was to set up an instance of LabKey server that forms the heart of the Knight Cancer Institute's data management system. So three main work areas that our team does. One is to actually set up and maintain the LabKey server instance. Second is to build tools for bringing data in to LabKey. And third is to build tools on top of LabKey that lets users easily visualize and explore and utilize the data. But again, at its core, LabKey is the heart. It is the integration point. It's the, for lack of a better phrase, one-stop shop for data. We don't want platform fatigue. We want to take all the data that's stored in these various silos and bring it into one single place. So let's actually take a look at some screenshots and some examples of how data is used to do precision oncology at the Knight Cancer Institute. So we're pulling all the data from around campus and from different labs, storing it, integrating it in LabKey. Let's suppose we want to have a patient-centric view of the data. Again, simple question. Show me all the data we have for a patient. Better yet, show me all the data we have for a patient and present it to me in a useful way, a way that makes my work as a clinician, as a researcher, easier. Again, simple question, but can be very, very challenging given the data management status quo. A concrete example with in some of the groups we support hold both clinical tumor boards where they consider patient treatments. We call data dives, where they actually focus on one individual patient for hours. Researchers and clinicians in the same room discussing different aspects of the patient's treatment history and what should be done about that. So I want to share with you one of the views we've built on top of and integrated with LabKey server to give a patient-centric view of the data. So you can see a screenshot here. I'm going to pause and just let you take a look at this. So this is a view that we built on top of our LabKey server instance. It's pulling data from the platform. And again, this is a patient-centric view of data, stripped PHI, of course, from it. I want to call your attention to the four main components of this. So in the upper right-hand corner, you'll notice just a basic summary: vital status of the patient, age, gender. What that's doing is surfacing a query that we've written in LabKey server. We call this the basic data display. And again, it's this little bar in the upper right-hand corner. Dominating your field of view, of course, is this what we call the patient view plot. And this is a plot that visually represents data stored in the system. And so you can see we've got the legend. We can toggle on and off various traces. We're representing, in this particular instance, treatments, as well as some biomarkers. If we had lesion size measurements, those would be plotted here as well. The graph is wholly interactive. You can zoom in, zoom out, click on points to call up details about the information that's being represented as a pip on the plot. Again, patient view plot is what you're looking at in the center there. To the right is the third of the 4 components that make up this page. We call this the clinical narrative sidebar. This is a hand-curated collection of data that's pulled from medical records. It's typically information that doesn't, for example, plot well or be represented well in tabular form, but it's very relevant to the patient's history. So again, we have a team of experts who go in and manually curate this clinical narrative sidebar on the right with information that both researchers and clinicians will find useful. And finally, in the bottom, you'll notice LabKey server grid views. And so what we've done here is taken a collection of grid views and nested them in a tab and sub-tab structure. This is essentially rendering the same data that you see in the plot, for example, except it's in tabular form. And this is useful for folks because while sometimes at a glance it's nice to take a look at a plot, you may want to drill down into the actual tabular data, perhaps export it, download it, do some offline analysis. And what the grid views in this tabbed data browser at the bottom let you do, again, is exploit the functionality of LabKey server out-of-the-box grid view. So again, this is, to take a step back, we are looking at a patient-centric view of the data. This is a tool we've built using React, Victory, and Slate, to name a few things. It's also, I'll call it widgetizable. So I've shared with you the 4 components in this framework, but the framework is extensible. If you wanted to, for example, add a new dedicated plot for some other purpose, you could simply define that within LabKey server, and it would render and be a component here. All of these components as well can be drag, drop, resize, etc. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. You can customize the page to your liking, depending on what sort of work you're doing. So again, this is a patient-centric view of the data, but of course, not everyone cares about a patient-centric view. You may, for example, want a specimen-centric view of the data. I'll share another view here with folks, and this is what we call the data inventory dash. So what this does briefly, what we see here is each row in this table is a specimen, and you'll notice there's a little arrow in the lower left. If there are child specimens, you can click on the arrow and that'll expand and show all the children that were derived from that specimen. So for example, blood is drawn from a patient. If that blood was separated into 2 separate files, by toggling on this little arrow, we can show the child specimens that were created from this. Looking at the columns, the left half of the view you see, those are facts about the columns. Stuff very similar to what Hannah just walked us through. For example, the type of sample, pathology record number, if applicable, collection date, etc. And then the circles you see in the right, the columns on the right half of the screen, those are assays that can be run against that sample. The intuition with the data inventory dash is we want to give folks at a glance ability to look at what assays have been run against a particular sample. Again, all that information is out there, but that at a glance functionality is really the value here. So you can quickly and intuitively understand what's going on with each sample. So we've taken a look at 2 different ways data within the Knight's LabKey server data management system is used by people. Patient-centric view, a sample-centric view. Let's actually take a look at how the data is integrated. So the I'll say high-level architecture. What does it look like? This is a fairly simple diagram. And I think folks will see a few things. First of all, I want to sort of address the layout of this diagram. You'll notice there's a blue dotted line horizontally, an equatorial line. Everything above that blue dotted line is user-facing. So it's things that clinicians and researchers are using on a day-to-day basis. Everything below that equator line is back-end, or things that sort of under the hood, what's going on. So taking a look at the stuff in the user-facing half, the top half, a few of these sort of views that look familiar. On the far right side, you can see a snapshot of the data inventory dash. Upper right, you will see the patient view plot. And in the center, you will see a LabKey server grid view. In this case, we have chemotherapy data that's tabularly represented. I want to share with two other new things. We're not going to take a deep dive into them, but I do want to mention them. Recently, we have connected our LabKey server instance to Tableau. And you saw Rob's demo earlier this week about how that works. Soraya Mitri, who manages the data team with the Knight Cancer Institute, has been working hard to create different summary reports using Tableau. These reports pull data from LabKey and then represented in Tableau. And these are custom tailored to particular audiences, but very powerful tool. You can see a little screenshot of it up here. Another thing I want to draw your attention to is this Omero image browser. I'm not sure how many folks out there use Omero, but Omero is a dedicated image management database. Currently at the Knight Cancer Institute, we have several thousand images, primarily histological images. So things like H&E slide scans, IHC slide scans. We have successfully integrated LabKey server as part of our data management system with Omero. We do that in a couple ways. First, every night, LabKey server queries out to the Omero server and says, Omero, give me metadata records for all relevant images. Those metadata records are then pulled into LabKey, stored in a data set that users can interact with through a data set grid view. We've also added a link in that data set that users can click on it, and what that does is launch within their browser a dedicated window that lets them actually dive into the slide, look at the image, zoom in, etc. Very nice functionality. So we've talked about stuff above the line. Spend a couple minutes talking about what's below the line. So we have some very extraordinary partners we work with. One of them is the DEP team, we call them, and they are responsible for maintaining a dedicated data mart, which we've connected to LabKey. And so this is for example, various, again, siloed resources on campus, such as our clinical genomics database, as well as our EPIC, of course, our EHR system, and our sample tracking system, which right now is a BioLibrary LabVantage system. All that data feeds into the Knight Data Mart, where we do some sort of data organization. We then pull that data into LabKey server using LabKey server's ETL processes. Very easy to set up and maintain, and again, those run on a schedule so that we know we have fresh data on a daily basis within LabKey. Also talked about Omero, we already talked about that. And also manual data entry. And so typically for each type of data, for example, chemotherapy data, we pull in records through an ETL process. But since we only have access through our ETL feeds to data that is, records of treatments that are done at OHSU or the Knight Cancer Institute, this doesn't give us all the data we need. For example, suppose someone was treated years ago in a different state. We want to know that a person received that particular chemotherapy treatment. But again, that's not stored locally in the OHSU EPIC system. So we have this is one of the responsibilities of Soraya's team, performs manual data entry directly into LabKey server. That manually entered data is then integrated with the ETL data and presented to the users in a single view of the data. Within LabKey server itself, we make extensive use of the study module. That's the heart. So lots of data sets, as well as a number of lists that constitutes the system. So just a couple more slides and we'll wrap up. This slide here shows the groups that we work with. And you remember back on an earlier slide, we talked about two main groups of users. Those were physicians or clinicians and researchers. On this slide here, you'll see in blue typical ways that each group of users use our data management system. And in braces to the right of those blue text, you'll see work that the DMS team does to support those groups. So along the top, you'll see the researchers. I mentioned researchers earlier. Those break down into two main types. Biological researchers, think of these as classically trained wet bench researchers. Computational researchers, perfect example, if you have a computational biology program or department at your institution, that is what they do. Typically, biological and computational researchers are asking very similar questions. Where they differ is the tools they use to actually do their work. Computational researchers, for example, are much more liable to use the API or APIs offered up in LabKey server than biological researchers, who are much more likely to use the UI to explore data. Clinicians are down in the lower left. Again, these are the people who are actually treating patients and using data stored in the data management system to do so. Then a group we haven't talked about much to date is the support group in the lower right-hand corner of the slide. I think this group is vital, and then we talked a little bit in an earlier slide about this. I think the best exemplar of a support team is the data team that Soraya Michi leads. Group is responsible for many things, including one is manual data entry, as we touched on earlier. Second is actually performing QC of the data. So once data is in the system, we need to make sure that it is correct. And Soraya's team is trained to do this. We use LabKey servers out of the box QC workflow to do that. And finally, generate reports on the data. This is something that the data team is increasingly doing. This involves everything from writing Tableau reports, as we talked about a few minutes ago, as well as simply using user-defined queries in LabKey server and surfacing those as query reports within the study containers. So a brief history, and then we're going to wrap up. The Knight Cancer Institute's LabKey server-based data management system began life as a research project, depending how you count, about 5 years ago. Initially rolled out as a Stand Up to Cancer project. The Brennan Colson Center for Pancreatic Care, who manages the Oregon Pancreatic Tumor Registry, was the first on-site, and by that I mean at OHSU group, to actually embrace the data management system that we have been looking at today. Appreciate their support. A few years ago, we began supporting serial measurements of molecular and architectural responses to therapy, or SMART, is the short way of saying that. Began life as an observational protocol, since has evolved and matured into a portfolio of clinical trials, starting with breast cancer, moving to other disease groups. In next steps, I mentioned all this organizational history just to set the context for next steps. So the LabKey system that we've been talking about, it began life as a small-scale research project. It's since grown into an institutional resource, something that dozens of people log into every day. So our charge as a team is the same, but success looks a little bit different, having matured again from a research project to an institutional resource. Got a number of next steps, things we're working on. We're lumping them right now under strengthening and scaling. One of the things we want to be able to do, for example, is to onboard a new clinical trial protocol within a given amount of time. We know that new trials are coming down, and we want to be ready to create containers and areas for them within our data management system to do that. We also know there's interest in utilizing and querying data across different trials. What this would mean effectively is querying across different projects in LabKey. Figuring out how to do that while ensuring that the data is interoperable. Remember, that's the I in fair, is one of our upcoming goals. And finally, integrating with additional components of the NITE's data management ecosystem. We're already integrating, as we mentioned, with Omero as well as the NITE Data Mart. But again, there's always new components being added as the ecosystem grows and matures. So we're pretty excited. We just wrapped up a pilot project where we have deployed per protocol containers, or in this case, operationally, those are per protocol projects within our instance of LabKey server, and looking into, again, sort of strengthening and scaling through that approach. So with that, I will stop. I'm a few minutes over. I want to say thank you to, this is just, I italicized especially, there's a lot more people we want to say thank you to, but especially this group. And again, thank you to LabKey for the opportunity to present today. And with that, I will be happy to take any questions.
Excellent job, Patrick. That was great. We do have a few questions here, and I'll try and summarize them as I can. So the first one refers, I believe, to one of the screenshots you shared on the patient-centric overview. Are those patient history notes in your sidebar manually transcribed from EHR clinical notes pulled from an intermediate database, which sources the EHR, or are they pulling the notes directly from the EHR?
That's a great question, and I encourage you, if you're trying to make sense of those particular notes, please don't, because that is again, it's sort of a mock-up mishmash of various notes. So those are manually curated. We've met with physicians numerous times over the years. The format and the content for those notes has changed over time, but you know, certainly in the recent past, that's involved a trained specialist logging into, for example, Epic, and poring over PDFs and handwritten notes, scans, and physicians' documents, and sort of distilling exactly what mattered to doctors, and then manually entering in. The WYSIWYG editor that we built on that view was meant to make data entry and curation of the data a little bit easier and more intuitive.
Awesome. And how do you manage PHI or PII, and do you have any differing needs between clinicians and researchers in terms of their access to that data?
Yep, that's one of our, that's a good question. Right now, I should add, we do not share the data outside of the institution, and we're using LabKey's permissions functionality to limit access to the data. So basically, you can't see the data if you're not in some way, shape, or form part of the particular protocol. I did mention that, you know, eventually one of our goals is to allow cross-project or cross-protocol querying of the data. I think we know we're gonna need to come up with a little more refined and nuanced way to either de-identify or protect PHI to make sure that we're compliant and within regulatory constraints to do that. But for now, you can't see the data unless you can see the data.
Great, and we have a couple of Omero questions. So Rochester is also integrating with the Omero.web viewer. How is authentication performed when you link out to Omero? Is it a single sign-on between the two systems?
No, at this time, to take a concrete example, if you click on the link we have metadata for images stored in Omero is stored on a LabKey server data set. One of the fields in that for each record is a link. Clicking on that fires up the browser, or fires up a different window in your browser that lets you navigate the image. When that first window fires up, you need to log in using your credentials into the Omero server. So you log in once to LabKey, you log in again when you access Omero.
And that was such a thorough answer that you actually answered the next question. So that was great. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Thank you.